David Strick had been inside his shared dead buildings. Factories with floors soft as paper, hospitals that smelled of mold and rainwater, houses where the air carried a silence that felt owned. But nothing like Brier Falls High. By May of 2012, the school was little more than a brick carcass at the edge of town. Windows smashed out, roof sagging. Graffiti sprayed over the Brier Falls High sign in dripping black paint. The North Wing had been closed for decades. Ever since May 14, 1982, when 21 students and their young teacher walked into room 3C during fourth period and never walked out. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, no explanation that didn't collapse under its own weight. 30 years later, the county voted to tear the whole thing down. The morning they started, the air was heavy with the smell of wet dust. Sunlight fell in angled beams through broken windows, catching swirls of plaster and insect husks. Strick was halfway down the north wing when one of his guys hit the far wall with a sledgehammer and froze. "Boss," the man called, pressing an ear to the plaster. "You hear that?" The sound was wrong. Not the solid thud of brick. Not the thin pop of drywall. It was hollow. Like knocking on a coffin you weren't sure was empty. They hit it again. And again. On the third strike, the wall cracked. On the fifth, it opened. The first thing Strick noticed was a smell. Cool and stale, metallic at the edges. Like a place that had been holding its breath for decades. Then the dust parted and he saw it. A hidden space. Maybe 15 feet wide. Floor to ceiling, sealed behind a wall no blueprint had ever shown. The room was lined with neat rows of school desks, each one facing a blackboard at the far end. And on that blackboard, written in slanted, uneven white chalk, May 14th, 1982, we are still here. The letters were thick, almost carved into the slate. The strokes jagged like the writer's hand had been shaking. Strick felt the fine hairs on his arms rise. This was no storage closet. This was a classroom, untouched, preserved. On the teacher's desk sat a stack of envelopes tied with a length of faded blue yarn. The paper was yellowed, the edges curled. The first was addressed in looping handwriting to Mrs. Fields, the mother of Joanna Fields, one of the missing. Strick slid the letter out just enough to see the words. "We don't know where we are. Please don't stop looking." For a long moment, no one moved. Even the noise from outside, the hum of the excavator, the clang of metal, seemed to vanish. 30 years ago, room 3C had been locked from the inside when the principal tried the door. The windows were latched. The fire exit bolted. The only trace left behind were 3 Polaroids from that morning. A class smiling for the yearbook, the last image of them alive. Now here was their classroom again, sealed like a tomb, with their words waiting in the dark. Strick backed out of the room, his voice low but certain. "Call the sheriff." Within the hour, the North Wing was swarming with deputies. Latex gloves snapped on. Evidence markers were set down in a grid. A photographer circled the room, catching every angle of the chalk writing, every scrap of paper, every desk. Sheriff Calvin Merritt, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who carried his silence like a weapon, stood in front of the board and read the message twice. He had been a rookie the day those kids vanished. The sound of the principal's voice breaking over the radio had lived in his head for 3 decades. They're not here. Now he was here, staring at the word "we are still here," and wondering if maybe, just maybe, they had never left. May 14th, 1982, began like any other spring day in Brier Falls, Illinois. By 7:45 a.m., the streets around the high school were alive with the usual rhythm. Cars idling at the curb, seniors leaning against a flagpole, girls comparing notes for a math test, the track team jogging slow laps around the football field. Room 3C sat at the far end of the North Wing, past the guidance office and a storage closet no one used anymore. The civics class that met there was a mix of juniors and seniors, 21 kids, all restless for summer, all counting down the days until freedom. Their teacher, 26-year-old Ellen Markham, had been in Brier Falls less than 2 years. She wore her hair in a loose knot, kept a jar of peppermints on her desk, and had the kind of smile that made you believe she remembered every student's name. She was the sort of teacher who wrote, Nice work. In the margins of your paper, even if you barely scraped AC. That morning, the room was a picture of normalcy. Michael Deacon sat in the second row, peeling the label from an orange soda. Joanna Fields leaned in toward her best friend, whispering something that made them both stifle a laugh. In the back, two boys hunched over a history worksheet, scribbling an answer seconds before the bell. At 11:15, the door opened and a man with a camera stepped inside. He was from the Brier Falls Gazette, there to take a few shots for the yearbook, a favor to the student committee. Ellen clapped her hands and told the class to gather in front of the chalkboard. They shuffled into position, arms slung over shoulders, one boy throwing bunny ears behind Ellen's head. The photographer took 3 Polaroids in quick succession. In the last one, Joanna is caught mid-laugh, her hair falling into her eyes. At 11:35, the bell rang. 10 minutes later, Janitor Bill Conway knocked on the door to collect a stack of maintenance forms. No answer. He tried the knob. Locked. He knocked again, harder. Silence. By noon, Principal Robert Dyer was standing in the hall with a master key. He turned it in the lock and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Every desk was in place. The windows were latched from the inside. The fire exit was bolted. Jackets still hung from the backs of chairs. Notebooks lay open, pens uncapped, as if the class had just stepped out for a moment. But the students and their teacher were gone. The police were called within minutes. By 12:30, the North Wing was swarming with officers. Every inch of the school was searched. Locker doors slammed open. Crawl spaces were checked. The ground were combed by volunteers and search dogs. By nightfall, there were roadblocks at every exit out of town. Parents gathered in the gymnasium, clutching the clothes their children had worn that morning. In the days that followed, quarries were drained, drainage tunnels inspected, surrounding farmland swept in grid patterns. Nothing. No footprints. No fibers. No trace of 22 living, breathing people who had been in that room less than an hour before. Theories took shape fast. Mass abduction, elaborate prank gone wrong, something a cult whispered about in the aisles of the grocery store. The town's name made national news for a few weeks. Then summer came, and the story slipped from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But in Brier Falls, the wound stayed open. The North Wing was closed off. Room 3C remained locked, the blinds drawn. The hallway leading to it fell into disuse, then decay. And for 30 years, no one crossed its threshold, not until the wall came down in 2012. The discovery of the hidden room spread through Brier Falls the way a storm moves across flat land. Fast, low, unstoppable. Within an hour, yellow tape was strung across the North Wing. The demolition crew was ordered out. Deputies in gloves and boot covers filed in with evidence tags and cameras. Sheriff Calvin Merritt stood in the doorway of Room 3C, or whatever Room 3C had become, watching the dust settle in the flashlight beams. He had been 24 the day these kids disappeared. Now, 3 decades later, the sight of those desks lined up, waiting, felt like someone had pressed a thumb into a bruise that never healed. On the teacher's desk sat the stack of envelopes. The blue yarn binding them had faded to the color of a cloud just before it breaks. Merritt crouched, slid a pocket knife under the knot, and eased the first envelope free. It was addressed to Mrs. Fields. He unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting leaned forward, rushed, a little shaky. "We don't know where we are. Please don't stop looking." The room seemed to tighten around him. He read it twice before tucking it back into the envelope, his fingers careful not to smudge the ink. There were 22 envelopes in total, one for each missing student, plus one more marked only with the letter E. All were logged, photographed in place, then sealed in clear evidence sleeves. The contents were heartbreakingly ordinary. "Tell Mom I forgot my lunch, but Sarah shared with me. Can you bring my cleats after school? He says we passed the test. We just have to stay quiet now. When the bell rings, we can go home." That last one was signed by Hannah Clive, 14 years old, soccer midfielder, missing exactly 30 years. Outside, the families began to arrive, some called by deputies, others drawn by rumor. They clustered behind the tape, clutching old yearbooks and photographs, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything. Richard Deacon stood apart from the rest. He wore a welding jacket, despite the spring heat, a manila folder clamped under one arm. His brother Michael had been in that room. Michael's letter was handed to him in the sheriff's office hours later. Richard read it under the buzzing kitchen light that night. "Tell Mom I'm okay. I think this is a prank, but nobody will open the door. I can hear people in the hall. They don't hear us. Don't forget my science project." It was dated May 14th, 1982. No time, no hint that anyone survived past a bell. And yet, on the blackboard in that sealed room, the words "we are still here" had been written in strokes so shaky they looked layered, like someone had gone back more than once to finish the sentence. The lab results confirmed it. The chalk pressure pattern showed the sentence was written in 3 stages, separated by time. First, "we are," then, "still," finally, "here." Merritt didn't know what to make of it, but he knew one thing. If someone had been inside that room long enough to write in 3 stages, then the story everyone thought they knew was already wrong. In the weeks after, each family was given copies of their letters. Some kept them sealed. Others read them until the paper softened at the folds. Deborah Fields, Joanna's younger sister, laid hers out across her dining table, wearing cotton gloves so the oils from her skin wouldn't stain the paper. Most were what you'd expect from teenagers trapped in a moment they didn't understand. Half-finished thoughts, notes of parents, complaints about homework. But one letter, and signed, stood apart. The handwriting was jagged, each line tilting more than the last. "Someone comes into the room at night. We don't know who. We don't think they're from the school." When Deborah read it aloud to Richard over the phone, neither spoke for a long time. In Brier Falls, silence meant more than words ever could. It was a pencil note in the blueprints that broke the first crack in the case. Alternate storage access deferred. The county archivist, Sylvia Kent, had pointed it out with a lacquered fingernail, almost casually, as she unrolled the brittle plans across a metal table in the record's basement. Sheriff Merritt leaned over her shoulder, frowning. What does that mean? Could mean it was planned but scrapped. Could mean someone wanted it off the books. Along the same wall in an electrical diagram, a dotted line labeled service conwould be ran like a secret artery. Richard Deacon, standing beside them, tapped the paper. Big enough for a person? Sylvia shook her head. Not unless someone widened it later. Later that week, a demolition subcontractor went back to the North Wing's foundation at Merritt's request. What they found made the sheriff's skin go cold. Behind the wall of room 3C was a narrow crawl space, no more than 2 feet wide, just enough for a grown man to squeeze through sideways. It ran the length of the north wing, before dead-ending at a brick partition, sealed solid. The brickwork was different, sloppier than the original construction, mortar smeared in uneven lines. There was no record of it in any maintenance log, no permit, no reason for it to exist. When news reached the families, reaction split. Some saw proof, evidence that their children hadn't simply vanished into thin air. Others felt only dread. If a person could move in and out of that classroom without being seen, what had they taken with them? Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with Michael's letter on one side and his brother's unfinished science project on the other. The diorama was dusty now. The paper soldiers bent at the edges, but the cotton ball cannon smoke was still glued in place. He made a new list on a legal pad. Who built the crawl space? When it was sealed? Whether they ever got out? And then, without thinking, he added what they heard when the lights went out. 2 days later, he drove to Missouri to meet the one man who might have answers, Leonard Phelps, the retired custodian who made those cryptic notes in 1981 about cold without air in the North Wing. Phelps was nearly blind now, skin papery, voice a thin rasp. When Richard showed him a photo of room 3C, the old man tapped the back wall without hesitation. There used to be a door there, he said, years ago, before they bricked it over. Why? Don't know. But the brickwork was sloppy. Every few weeks, I'd find the edge damp, like something was leaking through. Leaking? Phelps was quiet for a long moment. Not water, he said finally. Then he shut his mouth like a man who'd used up the last words he intended to give away. Back in Brier Falls, Richard pulled out Kelly Hahn's sketchbook again, turning to the final page, the charcoal drawing of the classroom. Along the back wall, she'd drawn that same second door, ajar just enough to show darkness beyond. In the margin, written small enough you could miss it, were 7 words. I hear someone whispering. Please come get us. That night, Richard went back to the demolition site alone. The crawl space was still marked with survey tape. He ducked under the barrier, dropped to his hands and knees, and slid inside. The earth was cool, damp under his palms. The air changed as he moved forward, thicker, heavier, like the space had been holding its breath for 30 years. About 20 feet in, he reached the brick wall. It was cold to the touch, and damp. He pressed his ear to it, telling himself there was nothing to hear. That's when he caught it. A faint scraping, followed by what might have been a breath, or maybe a voice, or maybe just the sound of his own blood moving through his ears. Richard pulled back fast, crawling toward the daylight with dirt under his fingernails and a thin scrape down his cheek from a protruding nail. By the time he reached his truck, the sound, if there had been one, was gone, but the feeling wasn't. In small towns, memory doesn't fade, it mutates. When word of the crawl space spread, the old stories came back. Things half remembered from the weeks before the disappearance. The smell in the hallway, a draft without wind, the way the lights in the north wing flickered just after lunch. Sheriff Merritt went looking for people who had worked at Brier Falls High in 1982. Most had moved away or passed on. But 2 names kept coming up. Joseph Cray, a janitor who'd retired the year before, and a man no one seemed to know much about, a short-term maintenance contractor named Raymond Thiel. Cray was 91 and in hospice. He had maybe 10 minutes of strength in him when Merritt and Richard visited. When shown the 2012 photo of room 3C, he didn't ask what it was. He just said, "That wall wasn't there when I left that day." "What do you mean?" Merritt asked. "I mean it didn't exist. I locked up the north wing that morning. When I came back after lunch, it was there, and no one could tell me who built it." Then he closed his eyes and wouldn't speak again. Raymond Thiel was harder to trace. His name appeared only once in the school district's archives, in an unsigned work order from the spring of 1982 for north wing wall alignment. No permit, no payment record, and a note at the bottom, check wall per request. They want it done before bell. No one knew who they were. Richard and Merritt dug deeper. Buried in a box of zoning appeals from 1981, they found another name, G. Everly. It appeared on a denied proposal for north wing access correction involving brickwork and soundproofing. When they asked a few surviving board members from that time, the answer was always the same: never heard of him. It was Deborah Fields who found the first real crack in the silence. She had been listening to cassette tapes pulled from Joanna's locker in 1982, tapes that had sat in police storage for decades. Most were normal teenage chatter, updates on school projects, complaints about homework. But one, labeled simply #5, was different. Joanna's voice was thin, almost whispering. "I don't know how many days it's been. We stopped getting lunch. We can hear people in the hall, but no one answers when we knock. Michael says he thinks we're dreaming, but the dreams feel like us. The lights never go out, but it's getting dark anyway." Then silence. Deborah called Richard immediately, her voice shaking. "That's not just fear, Richard. She's telling us they were still in there after the bell." Richard didn't answer. His mind had gone back to the crawl space. The cold wall, the faint scrape, the breath that might have been a voice. And in that moment, he realized something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. If Joanna's tape was real, then room 3C wasn't just a crime scene. It had been a prison. The tapes had been sitting in a police evidence locker for so long that the labels had started to fade. A handful were dated. Most weren't. Some had been recorded over birthday songs and radio static bleeding into half-finished conversations. But Merritt had ordered them all digitized now, so they could be heard without risking the fragile originals. Deborah came to the station on a gray Thursday afternoon with a thermos of coffee and the same cotton gloves she used for her sister's letters. Richard was already there, hunched in the corner like he'd been waiting hours. The first few tapes were exactly what they expected. Students talking into a cheap classroom recorder about their day. Laughter, shuffling papers, a burst of coughing in the background. Joanna's voice was bright, even when she was complaining about cafeteria food. Then came tape number 7. The hiss was louder this time, like the recorder had been set on the floor in the back of the room. For a while there was nothing but the low hum of fluorescent lights. Then a girl's voice, Kelly Hahn, spoke. "I think the wall sounds different now. Like it's hollow." There was a pause. Another voice, Michael's, answered. "Don't knock on it. He told us not to." The rest of the tape was silent except for a faint rhythm in the background. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. By tape number 9, the voices had changed. They were quieter, slower. The laughter was gone. Joanna said, "The clock's wrong. It keeps starting over." "What day is it?" another voice asked. "I don't know," Joanna replied, "but I think it's later than we think." Richard rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Later than we think," he repeated, like tasting the words. Then Merritt loaded the final tape in the batch, one with no label at all. The hiss filled the speakers again. A man's voice spoke, soft and hoarse, as if unused to speaking. "I don't know if this is working. I don't know if they'll hear this. They said the room was just for isolation, a couple hours at most. But the lights never turned off, and the clock's wrong. It keeps restarting." A pause. "Sometimes I still hear Joanna singing. Or maybe I'm remembering it, but something's moving in the walls." Then that faint tapping again. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Deborah leaned forward. "Play that part again," she said. Merritt rewound. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Richard was the one who caught it first. "That's not random," he said. "It's code." The room went silent, except for the hum of the old station's heater. Deborah's voice was low. "Morse code. I learned it in Scouts. That's SH. Still here." No one spoke after that, because if the code was real, then someone had been sending it, over and over, long after May 14th, 1982. The Morse code changed everything. Until now, the investigation had been about where the missing went. The code hinted at something worse. Maybe they'd never gone anywhere at all. Maybe they'd been kept. Richard couldn't let it go. He went back to the county archives the next morning, chasing the names that kept surfacing in fragments. RT LPG Everly. It was Sylvia, the archivist, who found the first piece, a rolled blueprint dated 1963, the year the North Wing was built. In one corner, half faded, was a box label, Module B. No one had mentioned it in 30 years. It didn't appear on any later plans. The location on the blueprint was strange, beneath the AV room, extending under part of the North Wing. But there was no access shown. No door. No stairs. Nothing. The initials LP were scrawled beside it in pencil. "Leo Parsons," Sylvia guessed, flipping through an old staff directory. "Facilities engineer, early 80s. Richard's stomach tightened when they found the next document, a typed letter from Dr. Leo Parsons himself, dated June 8, 1982, just 3 days after class vanished. The behavioral experiments must remain sealed. The children were not supposed to interact with the live feed until Phase 3, but the miscalibration of the soundproofing allowed feedback loops to develop. I recommend full isolation of the AV module until further notice. Any staff who observe the event should be reassigned immediately under closed NDA." Below the typed portion was a line added in pen, the handwriting slanted, almost frantic. "If the voices return, it means they made contact." Richard read it twice, then again. His chest felt tight, the same way it had in the crawl space. They dug further and found an incident report from April 1982. It named a temporary contractor, Raymond Thiel, as having been seen entering the North Wing late at night. When questioned, Thiel claimed, "They asked me to check the wall, but no one knew who they was." On the back of the report was a single sentence in handwriting no one recognized. "We are not alone in the room." By late afternoon, Merritt and Richard were staring at the old blueprint again, tracing the faint lines that marked the outline of Module B. If this was built, Merritt said, it's not for storage. No, Richard agreed. It's a containment. That night, Richard drove to the school site alone. The front gates were chained, but he knew another way in, through the overgrown lot behind the football field. He passed a rusted fire escape, the weeds curling up the brick, and slipped through a gap in the fence. Inside, the air was heavy and cold. The hallways smelled of wet plaster and something else, faint, chemical, like the tang that had leaked out of the sealed classroom. He found the spot on the third floor where the blueprint suggested the hidden access might be. His flashlight beam caught a section of wall that sounded just slightly hollow when he rapped it with his knuckles. 3 hits with a crowbar and the panel gave way. Behind it was a narrow corridor lined with aging sound-dampening foam. The floor was covered in industrial carpet, dark with age. His footsteps made no echo. 30 feet in, the corridor ended at a smooth cement wall. Set into the wall was a metal door, no knob, just an old keypad. Its plastic yellowed, its edges rusted. In the upper corner, faintly etched into the metal, were 4 characters. RTLP. Richard stared at them until the letters blurred. Raymond Thiel, Leo Parsons. Whoever they were, they'd signed this door like it was theirs. He reached out, touched the cold metal, and felt something shift in the air behind it. Pressure like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, somewhere deep inside the wall came a sound. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Still here. It took 2 months to get the order. Officially, the state authorized it as structural hazard remediation. Unofficially, everyone in the sheriff's office knew exactly what it was. Permission to open the door no one was supposed to open. On a cold morning in early October, the team assembled at what remained of the north wing. The air smelled of damp concrete and the metallic bite of tools. A forensic pathologist stood by with 2 assistants. Deputies wore Tyvek suits and respirators. The press had been told nothing. Sheriff Merritt and Richard stood side by side as the demolition crew positioned the hydraulic ram against the sealed metal door marked RTLP. On 3, the foreman called. The machine hissed, then slammed forward. The first hit dented the frame. The second tore the keypad loose, dangling it by a frayed wire. The third forced the door inward with a shriek of metal. What lay beyond was not the narrow storage alcove anyone expected. It was a corridor, long, windowless, wide enough for a single person to walk in file. The walls were smooth concrete. The air was unervingly dry, lacking the mildew tang every other part of the building carried. The corridor ended at another wall. But here, an opening gaped, leading into a room about the size of a classroom. 25 desks sat in perfect rows, each topped with neatly folded school uniform shirt. Some still had faded stickers on the collars. Smiley faces, glitter stars. Footballs. There were no books. No bags. No sign of who had folded the shirts, or when, on the far wall, written in chalk and precise block letters, "Remain still until the bell." The chalk was fresh enough that the edges of the lines were crisp. The pathologist stepped in, her voice low. "There's a smell, faint, formaldehyde." Everyone froze. There should have been no reason for that smell. No bodies, no biological material, no preserved specimens. Later tests would find no chemical residue. Behind the last row of desks, under a dust-shrouded tarp, they found 25 pairs of children's shoes. Each had a tag looped through the laces with name written in careful handwriting. Every tag matched a student from the missing class of 1982. No bones, no bodies, just the clothes and shoes, as if their owners had stepped out of them and vanished. Merritt stood in the center of the room, reading the chalk message over and over. He tried to picture the missing sitting here, waiting for a bell that never rang. Richard stayed at the doorway, his eyes locked on a desk in the second row, the one with Michael's initials carved into the edge. The groove in the wood was still there. When they left, the air in the room felt heavier, as if they were taking something invisible with them. That night, Merritt couldn't sleep. He replayed the chalk phrase in his head. "Remain still until the bell." It didn't feel like instruction. It felt like a sentence. 2 days after the room was opened, the evidence team began cataloging everything inside. They expected dust, decay, maybe rodent damage. Instead, the uniforms were crisp, the fabric threads intact. The shoes had no mildew, no rot in the soles. It was as if 30 years had never touched them. But when the lab began dating the materials, the results made no sense. The cotton in the uniforms tested as if it had been manufactured within the last 5 years. But the metal snaps on the collars had been discontinued in 1979. The leather in the shoes was supple, yet the model numbers hadn't been sold since the early 80s. The paint on the desk legs was a shade of industrial gray that no supplier had produced in over 3 decades. Yet the finish was flawless. No chips, no rust. It was like every object in the room belonged to 2 different times at once. Merritt sat in his office going over the reports when Sylvia from the archives walked in with something she'd been holding back. A sealed envelope addressed to Investigator of Record. It had been in a mislabeled file from 1984, marked as irrelevant. Inside was a single photograph. It showed room 3C as it had looked in 1982, desks in rows, blinds half drawn. But the angle was strange, as if the photo had been taken from outside the room, through glass. In the reflection of that glass, Merritt could make out the shapes of people, 20 or so students, standing in the hallway, watching the camera. One girl in the reflection had her hand raised in a wave. Her face matched a sophomore named Krista Meyer, missing since that day. But she looked older. Richard studied the photo under the harsh desk lamp that night. "It's like they've been waiting," he said quietly. "Not gone. Not here. Just waiting." A week later, an unmarked envelope arrived at Merritt's office. Inside was another photo, this one a class portrait, same 22 faces, same uniforms. But the background wasn't the school hallway. It was a wall from a hidden room, the one that hadn't been built yet in 1982. On the back, in faint pencil, "We heard the bell, but no one ever came." The handwriting matched Hannah Clive's letter exactly. For the first time since 1982, Merritt felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Not just confusion, not just dread. He felt watched. The envelope came on a Thursday, slid under Richard's apartment door, without a sound. No return address, just his name typed in neat block letters. Inside was a single Polaroid. The image showed a brick wall, close up. On the bricks was a faint chalk outline of a handprint. Small, child-sized, smudged black at the edges, as if it had been pressed there through ash. Beside the handprint, barely visible in the poor exposure, were 3 words. "We never left." Richard sat at his kitchen table, the photograph under the same buzzing light, where he'd read Michael's letter months before. He could feel the air in the room shift, like the moment before a storm. The phone rang. Not his cell, the old landline he barely used. He picked it up. At first, nothing but static. Then a voice, faint and young, whispering his name. "Richard." His grip tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" "Please," the voice said, and then the line went dead. Richard didn't remember the drive, only that he ended up at the school site again, standing in the skeletal remains of the north wing. The wind pushed through broken beams, carrying the hollow rattle of loose metal. He found the crawl space entrance still flagged with survey tape. The dirt inside was damp against his palms as he moved forward, the flashlight beam jittering with each breath. At the brick wall, he stopped. The same cold seeped through the stone, the same faint dampness. He pressed his ear against it. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. "Still here," he whispered into the wall. "Michael?" No answer. But the air seemed to pulse once, a subtle shift in pressure, like the wall itself had inhaled. When he backed out into the night, the school seemed quieter than it should have been. Too quiet. At home, the Polaroid still sat on the table. But now, when he looked at it, he saw something he hadn't before, reflected faintly in the sheen of the photo paper. Rows of desks, shapes sitting in them, heads turned toward the camera. And in the back corner, a man in a janitor's uniform, smiling. Richard stared until the image swam. He thought about the chalk on the board, the voices on the tapes, the photos that shouldn't exist. And he knew, with a certainty that made his hand shake, that the bell had never rung. It was still ringing. "We are still here."